Is everybody ready? Yes? Okay. So, welcome ladies and gentlemen. The motion for today's debate is this House and Serbia will develop closer ties with China at the expense of ties with the European Union. Representing the proposition we have team from Bulgaria, and on the opposition we have team from Singapore. From the proposition side, our speakers are first speaker Kalyan, second speaker Valentin, third speaker Tanya, reply speaker Valentin. On the opposition side, our speakers are first speaker Alina, second speaker Hao Tian, third speaker Daryl, and the reply speaker Hao Tian. Each speaker will have 8 minutes to deliver their speech. The first and the last minute of each speech is considered protected time, during which points of information POIs may not be offered. The judges will signal the end of protected time at the 1 minute mark, after which POIs can be offered, and will signal the return to protected time at the 7 minute mark. At the 8 minute mark, they will give a double clap or ding to signal the end of speech. Additionally, there will be 3 claps or dings at 8:15, and the judges will stop listening at 8:30. Best of luck to both teams, and I'll hand over the floor to our third judge.
Thank you. Welcome guys. Welcome to the quarterfinals of the WSDC Championships 2024. My name is Serena. I'm from England. I'm here for the chat. I'll allow my panel to introduce themselves and do a circulation from left to right.
Hey, hi, I'm Atara from Indonesia. Good luck for both teams.
Oh, hey, Lucia. Best of luck. Ali, Australia.
Yeah, Malaysia.
Thank you. Before we start, can you just have one more round of applause for both teams for making it so far into the quarterfinals? And also, I would like to give the debaters the opportunity. I'd like to give the debaters the opportunity to introduce themselves to each other and reveal their quarterfinals if they'd like to do so. So, on side proposition, I believe we have Team Bulgaria. Would you guys like to introduce yourselves?
Sure, Kosovo.
Huh?
Introduce yourself.
So, how? I'll be the first speaker.
Okay, I'm Valentin, I'm the second speaker in the reply. Good luck to everyone.
My name is Tanya, I'm doing third speech, and
And on side opposition, we have Team Singapore.
Hi, my name is Alina. I'll be the first opposition speaker.
Hi, my name is Tom. I'll be the second and the reply.
Hi, I'm Daryl. I'll be doing the third. Good luck.
Thank you guys. I will be using a timekeeping app to record your speeches, so please let me know if you can hear or cannot hear the following. Okay. Excellent. Without further ado, I'd like to invite the first speaker of the proposition to open the debate.
There. Then something like this.
За майка България. Айде. 3, 2, 1. I am a Serbian. The EU tells me to concede my history, then the fact that we are the only responsible side for the Yugoslav wars, then that I have to cave to the Croats who also committed war crimes against my parents, against my people. The intuition is really simple, I think. I will be furious. And what does this mean? That I will demand for this to not happen, but even if it does, I will go and protest and people might get hurt. We are against this. This is reality. Propose. Team line of proposition. First of incentives of Serbia, then on the delta, then on argument 1 on Serbia attempts will be in vain, therefore we waste active time, then on argument 2 on civil unrest, and then in second on economic development. So, the interests of Serbia are as follows. Serbians have to be happy, and also we have to win on economic development too. Therefore, but these can be linked, but also are generally separate. Then onto the delta. What opposition side has to stand for? No, firstly, they cannot have good deals with China because firstly, they believe that they will be, basically the EU will lose their funds due to no security. They believe that they'll, like, when you actually receive the money, you actually go and then go to China simply to steal from them. But also, they prioritize BRICS state. No, therefore, we actually have, we actually prioritize BRICS states as China, for example, because I don't know. I believe that their economy actually benefiting is kind of more secure than the other thing. Also, EU gives me requirements because that is how they assure themselves, as I explained. No, therefore, the bottom line is that proportion exists. If the EU connection is strengthened, China connections are also weakened. This is how it works. Then, what do we stand for? We stand for closer relations to China. This means we have no economic tariffs. We have better loans with them. We have development projects such as further inclusion and more funds received from the Belts and Roads, for example. But even we stand for BRICS membership in this case. Why is this going to happen? Because that's how China achieves security, dear panel, and therefore they actually have an incentive to get this. And the thing is that even if about the BRICS thing, it's simply a thing that actually enlarges our impacts. It's not something that we're contingent on. Then, moving on to Serbian attempts will be in vain, and therefore we're simply losing time by doing this. The setup for this argument is the following. By many facts the thesis is simple. By many facts that prevent us from joining, but also from the ones that that are simply in the info slide and you cannot go against them, I will explain why this is not a thing that is actually in reality. Why? Okay, firstly on the many things that I'm talking about. We're talking about every country needing to agree. Therefore, every country in the EU has the ability and the incentive to request something from Serbia. Like Germany, for example, demanding something small like smoking inside to be forbidden, but also something big, like the Green Deal, for example, or admitting guilt for the Yugoslav wars, which is going to be requested by Croatia, for example, in this case. But why the specific two things that are in the info slide are going to happen, are never going to happen? Firstly, on the democratization not happening. The politicians of Serbia have no incentive, understand this. Because firstly, they have to admit that they have problem with corruption, dear panel. They are going to lose immense number of votes that way. But also, they simply want to continue stealing if they have the ability to do so, which right now they do. This is simply the case. This is the reality in the Balkans. If they actually want to debate in their liberal bubble, good luck. But then, Kosovo also, the recognition is impossible because people will be extremely mad and now lose extreme amount of votes. Imagine, there were already protests for further, action when actually Kosovo declared independence, for example. Imagine if I tell my electorate that I'm going to recognize them as an independent state, dear panel. This is going to be immense. But also, I admit defeat to all the things that I have been doing in my attempts to actually reclaim this land. Therefore, there is no way this is going to happen. Therefore, it is never going to happen that we are going to there'll be a member, let alone we have actually at best attempts. And please read the motion again and see that these are only attempts. There is no security of actually getting in the EU. Then, why the EU would never actually care for me if I'm not directly in the EU? Firstly, they prioritize members because developing their economies, like the member economies, means the big countries develop their own economies in this way. And also, this is the populist thing to do. Like, people in the EU vote, therefore I'm going to develop people in the EU. But also, they don't want to risk money, as I already explained, because they think that they'll simply go to China otherwise, like after you steal their money. Then why actually China will accept me without any conditions? Because they don't care about democracy, because they actually care for allies more than EU, because they don't have active allies in Europe right now. What are the impacts of this? On their side of the house, we waste time when But actually, we can actually capitalize on it because we'll actually never get in. But even if we do, this is only going to happen after the current generation is going to forget about the Yugoslav wars in this way, which is going to happen at least 40 years from now in this case. On the comparative, we start receiving money right now. Therefore, we get money easier. Therefore, on development, just on this, we have 40-year advantage. Therefore, at the end of the day, it is better to have some union than no union, even if they prove that the EU is better. Then, the Serbian population will be extremely unsatisfied. Why is this the case? Even if, for example, we actually do get it. Imagine that this is, I have 4 reasons here. Firstly, anti-Western sentiments towards the EU due to Yugoslavia being bombed by NATO, for example, in such cases. But also anti-Western sentiments against EU by specific states like Croatia, who actually have committed war crimes against you like 20 years ago, dear panel. But also, Croatia will give you certain conditions which actually you have to accept, as I already explained. No. Therefore, you're actually going to be extremely mad because it looks like you're selling yourself. You're actually selling your history. You're selling your dignity as a nation, dear panel. This is extremely problematic, but also it looks like you're politicians selling themselves in this way. But finally, I hate when someone is telling me what to do on the smaller scale too. For example, if I'm used to smoking inside, which actually a lot of Serbians do, if they tell me that I cannot do that anymore, I'll simply be mad because the daily things are kind of really important to me, like a lot. Why then this backlash is going to be so extreme? 2 reasons. Firstly, recent memory of the war. Therefore, I'm still radicalized by the propaganda that was said, but also by my parents who actually lived through these horrors. But also, Serbians are Balkans. Therefore, they're extremely nationalistic. This is kind of true, dear panel. Therefore, people will go crazy like Kosovo, because I don't know, this is kind of true. Then, why China will actually like me more? Because in the past, we actually have no past with them in this way. Actually, they don't expect anything, but they don't impose limitations, as I said. They don't care about democracy. They don't care about Kosovo because they have Taiwan, I say. But also, they don't forbid it for smoking inside, let's say. Therefore, people feel invalidated and irrelevant in their state, in their side. This is the main impact. Therefore, we stop voting in the state. We stop paying taxes. We stop trusting the state. Therefore, we don't do crimes. Therefore, for example, the state cannot give me social services to the best, etc. But also radicalization. Why is this happening? Because nationalistic parties like Vojislav Šešel's party is going to capitalize on this with the rhetoric of the say, they stole our state, let's regain it in this way. But also, how people are going to react to this. They're extremely emotional and they believe it because they're radicalized. Therefore, they'll be extremely pissed. Therefore, protest, dear panel. And it only takes one person to get a knife there to actually have a huge impact on the people's health. But also, there are people who go to these protests for the specific reason to actually get there. But also, at the end of the day, I believe it is important to protect the people and to actually make them happy. This is only going to happen on side proposition propose.
One says, I am a Serbian. But Serbians in the past 20 years have admitted guilt to genocides. They have sent their leaders off into the ICTY for entrance to the EU. They have spent a lot just to gain membership. So when they say, for some reason on our side, Serbians will rage, no, it is on their side of the house when they view they have lost so much for a cause that government had just given up on that they will rage on the side of proposition. So their whole push on Serbians being angry and causing anarchy is not just hyperbole, it is more likely to happen on their side of the house. A few points are set up. As Serbia, we will develop closer ties with the EU at the expense of relations with China. I want to be clear that this debate is by a trade-off. They can't claim any way down the bench that pursuing ties with China would simultaneously gain closer relations with the EU. Lastly, they have to prove a majority burden to prove that this is beneficial to the majority in Serbia. Insofar as the vast majority of the Prop 1 case was negative and spent on just disproving our case, they have not proven a majority benefit. That is a burden they need to fix. Case divide. 1. On why EU empowers Serbia. Second, on why proposition retrogrades economic development. And my second speaker will talk about economic diversification. Before that, rebuttals. First, on the whole claim of EU being bad. The assumption of the argument is that EU will not accommodate. They have one mechanism, that countries are self-interested. First, not true, because the vast majority of these countries in the EU need mutual cooperation because they collectively export to many countries around the world. That is why one country exports more. That is good for all the countries in the EU. But secondly, their example is just weird. Why would Germany try to ruin relations with Serbia just because people in Serbia smoke? We think this is an extremely trivial example that only retrogrades their case. But finally, even if bigger countries, for example, pressure Serbia to be more environmentally friendly, maybe that's a good thing because then we think EU, with all of its funds, is able to fund these projects. EU is interested in environmental projects and they do have the funds to back these up. Secondly, they say on their side of the house then, once they try to cultivate relations with China, they immediately get money, aid, economic development, even membership to BRICS. I think that's a huge logical leap, right? First, they need to prove why China would even value Serbia in the first place and why this relation cultivation will be successful. But secondly, BRICS are made up of incredibly big countries, which are very powerful. Maybe China might want Serbia to join, which they have yet to prove. But second, why would the rest of the countries want Serbia to join this exclusive club? That is completely unmechanized on their side. Finally, they say China will be an extremely benevolent donor. They forget to tell you the other half of the story, when China has left so many countries in debt traps, when China has seized the ports, the most important ports of many countries in the world today. So they need to contend with China being not benevolent, but I'll prove more why they're very likely to do this to Serbia as well in my arguments. Finally, the second argument on the Serbian population. And under this, they have two assumptions. One, that they're anti-Western sentiments. As I've proven, that is not true. But secondly, if that is true, we think that's better if you can actually forge cooperative ties with Croatia, get fresh aid from the EU, and be included in this European community and benefit economically. That's when you cross sentiments of anger on our side of the house. But finally, they have something very weird in their claim, which is that Serbians will be barbaric and just rage in the streets. They'll commit anarchy and commit crimes. I think it's a very reductive characterization of what Serbians really are. In 2022, they protested against the undemocratic means that the governments have been using to consolidate their power. So we think Serbians are completely rational and they do know what is best for them. For all those reasons, their case is out. My argument on why closer ties with EU empowers Serbia. The premise of this argument is that EU has incentives to accommodate Serbia and let them in. One, they want to counter Russian influence. Since the inception of the Russian-Ukrainian war, there have been stronger desires to consolidate European alliances and expand their influence in the region. Russia now already has 20% of Ukraine's territory. On the map, they are creeping into the territories of Western Europe, hastening the desire of Western European states to thus retaliate against this. This looks like NATO expediting the membership of countries near Russia and Ukraine. So similarly, given that the vast majority of the countries in NATO are also in the EU, we think EU also has incentive to relax these requirements for strategic reasons we have already outlined. This looks like, for example, Hungary being let off the hook for refusing to impose sanctions on Russia because EU was afraid of Hungary slipping over into Russian hands. It looks like EU not condemning Spain's suppression of the Catalonian independence movement because they want Spain to remain in the EU. Secondly, we also think as long as Serbia does not start to develop closer ties with China, EU will treat Serbia well because they do fear that there might be a risk that Serbia might leave in the middle of this cultivation of relations. So we think it is this fear that will also lead the EU to treat Serbia well in the long run as well. The upshot is that EU will not just let them in, they will also try to benefit Serbia. The impacts then are incredibly significant. One, the the EU is a very big source of aid. The EU has this policy called the Common Agricultural Policy, which means that member states don't compete with each other for agricultural exports. All member states export together. That means the more Serbia, Germany, and everyone else produces, the more money the entire European countries earn. That is why they're more very likely to give aid to Serbia's industries, given that a benefit to Serbia's industry benefits EU as a whole. But secondly, joining the EU gives Serbia access to a market, access to resources, and that is cheaper resources at the point when there are no longer exchange rate costs, when there are lower transportation fees across the continent of Europe. But thirdly, they get access to EU allies, which spans the world. It looks like US, Australia, Japan, everyone in G20, Singapore even. And that is how we're able to gain a large market and more resources. But finally, they get more sustainable loans because when the euro is more stable, banks are more likely to loan to you. Second argument, why proposition retrogrades Serbian economic development. Before that, yes.
Why do you think then, if it is so beneficial, currently Serbia is seeking funds from the Belt and Road Initiative, and this is factually true, please?
Because that is because EU hasn't let them in. When EU lets them in, they will stop. Back to my second argument then. The premise of this argument is that China will use Serbia as a dumping ground for its exports. Why? Because Serbia is strategically unimportant for China. It is a landlocked country with no ports. It doesn't have a lot of natural resources. When agriculture brings up 14% of its economy, and industry makes up 29% and service makes up 60%. Therefore, there's no organic incentive for China to sink any cost into developing Serbia. But secondly, China has no accountability. It is an authoritarian state, insulated from domestic and international scrutiny. But more importantly, all of its allies are weaker than itself. No one has any leverage over China compared to EU, which does need support from the US, for example. But thirdly, on proposition, Serbia has zero leverage over China as well, because they have no other alternatives. Once they start working with China, they are isolated by the US, by the EU. So by virtue of the motion in expense of, that further means that on their side, Serbia will be subjugated to exploitation and manipulation by China. On their side, they let Serbia walk into the mouth of a tiger. The impact then is that one, Serbia will be unable to develop past its current economic development. Huawei, for example, has already established a dominant presence in the electronics industry. But secondly, here's the weighing. Even if, in some instances, China might be good, we think the lack of accountability outweighs this. Because for the first, certainty of benefit. They could prove China could do good things, but on the other hand, China could also do bad things. So you don't know when China is going to do these bad things. For example, in Nigeria, they provided aid at first, but ultimately, when they started withdrawing aid, they left Nigeria isolated and poor. That is an alternative we will never support. We're proud to oppose.
I didn't speak of that speech. The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 18 seconds. Now it's the second speaker of the proposition for further response.
Just a second. Okay. Ah. Okay. Great. This speech will start on my next word. Dear panel, we should know the Serbian national identity. These people hate regulations. These people hate other people to tell them what to do. They hate being commanded by an external force, and this only happens on their side of the house, and this is the biggest priority for Serbia. Let's begin firstly with rebuilding our case. Secondly, on the question of does the EU have incentive to let Serbia in? And thirdly, on the question of exploitation. Fourthly, on economic benefits. Right. What do they tell us about our case? Firstly, they tell us we have never proven a benefit as a call-out. Notice, we say we don't waste 40 years not getting money from either side of the house. I think this is a pretty big benefit because we get money from China, they don't get money from the EU in 40 years. Do you know what's the difference of 40 years of development? iPhones were created in 10 years, for instance, in this sort of way. In 40 years, we will have a lot of technological advancement in AI and absolutely everything. And we are 40 years in the future from them. I think this is a pretty clear benefit. But secondly, they say countries in the EU cooperate with each other, and this is why they will let Serbia in. Notice, me as an individual country have the biggest incentive to please my voters. Notice, if they hate Serbs due to history, for instance, I won't let them in the EU because then I will not be in power the next time I'm voted in. Right. So even if I have the incentive to cooperate, my biggest incentive is to please my voters. So my incentive reason is better than their incentive reason because it is logically prior to their incentive reason in this sort of particular way. Right. This looks like Croats having history with Serbs. They will never let them in no matter the cooperation if they don't admit that the Yugoslav wars were only their fault in this sort of way. Right, because they won't be in power. Then they say anti-Western estimates were never proven. Panel, we proved them. We say that in the past, the Yugoslav wars, all of these things, the propaganda that the West is bad and the Yugoslavia is good in this sort of way, and we even say parents have spread these narratives to their children because they believe this is the truth and they want to say the truth to their children so that their children know the reality. So we say that these narratives have continued throughout time, but even if they haven't, notice the Yugoslav wars were not that far away. They were like 10 years ago. So the people are still alive, they still very much vote, and they are still very much the majority of the people. Right. Then let's continue to the questions in this debate. Firstly, on does the EU have incentive to do this? They give two reasons. I will rebut the two reasons and remind you of the four reasons we give beforehand. They firstly say they want to expand into Serbia because they are afraid of Russia. Notice, I want to flip this reason. They fear backlash from Russia if they try to get to Serbia. They have seen what happened with Ukraine when they tried in this sort of particular way. They have seen how it destabilized the region a lot, so they don't want this thing to repeat. So they're unlikely to get Serbia in because they're afraid that Russia will backlash during the process that this is happening. Right. But also, and why is this bigger incentive than being afraid? Well, they kind of never explain how this fear looks like. Why am I so afraid? I actually mechanize this to you. But secondly, they say you are afraid China will get it. Panel, they never explain why China cares for, why the EU cares for Serbia. We believe China cares much more, but EU does not care. Why? Because it has all the other countries in the region. It has Bulgaria, it has Romania, it has every country, Bosnia and Herzegovina, I think. It has literally everything in this sort of particular way. So it does not care for having access to the Danube, for instance, for having influence in the Balkans, through which crucial trainways, for instance, go in this sort of particular way, or the airspace, or the tariffs, and all these things. They don't care because they already have this, while China uniquely cares. Please write this down. Right. Then they say, yeah, sure.
China has no incentive to work with Serbia because Serbia is landlocked and does not provide the incentives that China.
Guys, do you say they don't have ports? They have ports at the Danube River. It's the biggest river. It leads to it's the biggest river on the European Union. It leads to Vienna, for instance. It leads to everything. They can literally go from sea in this sort of particular way from the river to the sea. Right. Okay, then let's continue further on. They say no one can control China exploitation, blah, blah, blah. Right. Notice, China has an incentive to develop its allies. Please notice this. Why? Because they can trade with them more. When their allies have more money and are richer, people in these ally countries want to buy more, so they get, so that they can export more. So they want their allies to be rich. They're an export economy in this way. But secondly, notice how they have bigger power when imposing imposing, for example, sanctions in this sort of particular way. When their allies are highly developed, imposing sanctions is much bigger power, because only China imposing sanctions doesn't mean a lot, because you're diversified. But the whole of BRICS doing it, this is when it means a lot. This is when this is like 60% of the economy of the world or something like this. Right. Okay. Then let's continue to the third argument. Let's continue to the third argument on the economy. Right. Why does China have a bigger incentive? Notice the first argument was why they won't get in. The second argument is why even if they get in, they will feel horrible. The third argument now is even if they get in, they will still get better economic development on our side. We bring the first argument, which is a precondition to anything they say, and now two arguments why we still win even if you don't buy this, which you definitely should. Right. Economically, China will contribute more to Serbia. Why? It needs allies in the region. Notice, China doesn't have any allies there, and it wants to have allies near the EU. Why? Because firstly, it's a show of strength. I am on your territory. I am here where you should be, not I am, in this sort of particular way. It shows the EU that you're strong, so you want the EU to believe you're strong so that it doesn't like put sanctions on you, for instance, or it doesn't stop you from taking Taiwan in this sort of particular way. So you want the EU to think that you're strong, and this is the way you do it. But secondly, you can gather intel on the EU if you have a hub in the EU in this sort of way. Serbia can be the perfect hub for China so that they can gather intel on the whole of EU that is crucial for how they will develop, for instance, for whom they will trade, what are the plans of the EU, so that they know what and when to do, when to produce, when to put sanctions, all these sort of things, so that they can develop the most strategic way. But secondly, EU doesn't have this incentive. I already explained, it doesn't care to develop Serbia as much because it has Bulgaria, Romania, all these countries. It doesn't have the incentive to get one more country in the same region. This is something they don't care about. But secondly, they have more of an ability to do this. Why? China has bigger amount of money for outside investment. The structural reason for this, first, it's factologically true, but the structural reason is that they're not democratic, which means they can allocate more money on the outside or having more influence on the outside rather than countries like the EU, which are democratic and their voters care for about every cent that goes outside but should have went to them, and the opposition strawmanning the government that didn't give the cents to them, telling them, oh, you should have given the money to me, not to this random outside country, Serbia, right? But China doesn't have this. So the EU can invest much more, while China doesn't have the ability to invest much more. What are the impacts of this? Firstly, the impact that it okay in the first speech. I take all these impacts now. But secondly, more investment means more factories being built, more jobs, higher salaries due to the competition in the labor market being bigger because there are the same amount of people who work but more workplaces, which means that you can argue for a higher salary, right? So for all of these reasons, the Serbian people have a better standard of living. Vote for us.
Two clashes in my speech. First on EU, second on China. First, on the EU, and I want to point out here first and foremost that the premise of their first argument that they drop is that Serbia has to change to accommodate the EU. But we proved to you it's actually the converse, that the EU has to change to accommodate Serbia instead, for two reasons. One, because now they face competition from China, and second, that they face competition from Russia as well. They are debating here not against the weight of analysis, but of the weight of fact that we proved to you in our arguments, that the EU historically has caved to Hungary and undemocratic country. For instance, NATO has expanded membership. They have allowed Spain to go on in Catalonia, even though they similarly don't recognize Catalonia's independence as well. And I want you here to compare this to the logical strength or lack thereof of their claims, because they just assert to you that Serbia has to give in without explaining why. That is the less likely outcome in this debate, because Serbia in this debate has higher leverage, given that both actors are competing over it, and comparatively, it has more options. So it is Serbia that is exerting leverage over the EU right now in the current geopolitical situation, not the other way around. No response, therefore, to the examples and factual analysis we give you in our comparative in first speaker. So they have yet to prove an active harm of joining the EU, because those 40 years are not wasted once the EU lets you in. Their only response is a one-liner in second speaker, that the EU is afraid of Russian backlash. First of all, that is not true, because the EU, unlike NATO, is not a defense agreement, and therefore doesn't that really pose a threat to Russia right now, which wants more of those security benefits. Second of all, even if it were true that Russia has an incentive to exert backlash on you in its current economic state, where the ruble has plummeted, where they are currently engaged in a war that is a war of attrition, they are unlikely to significantly be able to exert any sort of pressure on the EU, especially given that their economic ties are currently very limited since most EU countries sanction Russia. Lastly, I want to flip this claim, because if you are afraid of Russian backlash, what you are likely to do is get Serbia and give them more incentive to join you by relaxing your requirements, because that is the way to expand your bloc against Russia and prevent Serbia from turning to Russia in the future. That argument, therefore, is flipped. No response, therefore, to our first argument, that once you do join the EU, as a proof, they give you significant benefits because they have an incentive to make you stronger. Because unlike China, which uses its allies as dumping grounds for its excess exports, the EU exports as one common market. So the strength of its members is its collective strength. Their only push, therefore, reduces to one very reductive characterization of what Serbians are. They say Serbians are angry, and I want to note here, the impact they have to defend is not just that they are angry. It is, as they say, that Serbians stop paying taxes and start doing crimes. You need a stronger mechanism to prove such radical impact. But we flip this to you. If it is true that I am a Serbian, I have already given up a lot, like, for instance, already conceding guilt to genocide in 2010. So it is far more anger-inducing if after 15 years of trying to join the EU, I get nothing in return, because my government just sits down and gives up. Why then is our mechanism the more likely one? Because the concessions that they talk about have actually already happened in the status quo. So the turning point in this debate is not whether more of those concessions happen, it is whether I can get any compensation as Serbia from the EU in the form of aid. So on weighing, our mechanisms are much more believable. They didn't have a one-liner about Croatia that they dropped in their second speaker, but we argued due to no response. Then you get better relations with Croatia. If now through the EU, Croatia has to give you aid instead of the other way around. No comparative, therefore, on their side, on how they better relations with Croatia. Their case, therefore, in second, shrinks to a one-liner, more fit for a child than a country. They say Serbia is a population that is just angry if anyone tells them what to do. That is reductive. I think from my examples you can tell that Serbians do value democracy over things like smoking because of, for instance, their current president being pro-EU, or for instance, the pro-democracy protest in 2022. So agreeing to things like a Green Deal might be good because they get mutual benefit from the EU as well. No response. Next, on China. And I want to point out here, they give us no comparative at all on what China does. They only say that China has no past with Serbia. That may be true, but China has very horrendous past with other countries. For instance, Sri Lanka, which suffers because of the honeymoon to airport debt trap. So what happens on their side is that after a while, like they abandoned Nigeria, pulling out from 200 billion to 12 million investment, they will abandon Serbia as well. So I would submit that the way to quieten nationalism and to stop selling yourself is not to give yourself over to a larger and more alien foreign power. No response here to a second argument on China's subjugation. So on their side, instead of parents telling their children about the Yugoslav wars from 20 years ago, they talk about the Huawei factory and the Bank of China right opposite Crown Plaza, crowding out every single other Serbian factory and Serbian good. On weighing, therefore, that form of hatred is more likely to persist in the future because China's presence will entrench itself economically as it proves. So I then want to answer the question on whether China wants the allies to do well. And here, that second just gives you an unexplained assertion that China cares much more. The underlying logic here is that China has no other allies in the region. That is not true. It is Hungary, Greece, Italy, all of which have submitted to be part of the BRI and are much more economically stronger allies right now. They are much more desirable. Lastly, therefore, they say China wants Serbia to join because they want allies in the EU. First of all, it is not a show of strength because other Eastern European countries are already with the EU. So comparatively, in Europe itself, China is still going to be a much smaller power. But second of all, China cannot gather information from Serbia if it is not part of the EU at all. Their last point, therefore, is that China has higher ability because it has more money. That is not true. Per their own analysis, China has to juggle BRICS countries, all of which are also in similar stages of development and are unlikely, therefore, to do so. So there are certain impacts of jobs, developments, and factories fall out of this debate. Third argument on economic diversification. And I here want to point out that the premise is that we get more economic diversification for a few reasons. One, before I go, yes.
Stop lying that Italy is a China ally. Stop lying that Vučić is a pro-EU person and start explaining why Croatia will let Serbia in if they don't make a concession. That will never happen. Reality
Because
is not your
in that case, they get mutual concessions from each other, mutual cooperation, and mutual help. That is far better for relations in the future. First, therefore, the EU has more individual countries and markets, and each one has its own supply chains and own comparative advantages in its own areas of specialization. China, comparatively, is one country that specializes in much of the same things as Serbia, like agriculture and manufacturing. So they have a counter-incentive to actually keep Serbia in a lower stage of development so they do not compete with each other. Whereas for Europe, if one country is weaker in times of economic crisis, for instance, other countries can supplement for the decrease in demand for that one country. So what this looks like is China being rather weak in ability right now because of the failing housing market, forcing them to cut back on foreign aid and focus on their own domestic economy. That means a reduced demand for Serbian exports, which is why in almost every single country that China is allied with, every one of those countries suffers from a trade deficit with China and loses money in that trade. Second of all, because the economies of Europe and Serbia are more complementary, because as I explained, they don't compete on the exact same industries, they have a greater ability and incentive to uplift Serbia's economy. So at the end of this debate, I think, if at the end of this debate both teams want to wash out on incentive and ability, we win on the accountability analysis we give to you in our first speaker that is not responded to, that China is fundamentally undemocratic, that it can isolate Serbia from any other EU support, and once it does that, it will death threat Serbia to death. So for all of those reasons, you must oppose.
I invite the speaker, speech to speakers wait for 8 minutes and 13 seconds. We now ask the third speaker with propositions and further policies.
Is it okay if I do it here? I dare you to go out into the street outside of the university and say out loud that Kosovo is an independent republic. I promise you that the Serb is literally going to break your kneecaps, and this is the cold, harsh reality that you have to live with. Why do we win this debate? A few points in this speech. First of all, on correct characterization of the Serbian people and what they want as a republic and both as a nation. Secondly, as to is the Serbia going to be capable to enter the EU in the first place, because this is the precondition to every single one of their benefits. benefits because we don't care how good the EU is if we can never achieve it. But also, thirdly, as to why BRICS and China are the better alternative. Extremely proud to propose today. No, first on culture that Serbians have. Kosovo je duša Serbije. This is an anti-Kosovo song that millions of Serbians are singing. You can see the volunteers cheering in the back. This is interpreted deeply into the culture, but also for structural reasons, simply because they have to maintain this sort of nationalistic ideology in order to, for example, feel strong where things happen. When they feel like other countries like Croatia are trying to limit them, this is the thing that gives them strength, and this is the thing that politicians have the populist incentive to spread amongst the Serbian people in order to get their votes, in order to make them feel uniquely heroic. But also, you can walk out into the streets, there are flags literally every 10 meters on the road. These people are extremely proud. But if you don't buy the reality, because I understand not everyone here is from the Balkans, there are reasons as to why Serbia cares a lot about their dignity. Hey, Serbian history. Serbia has historically fought a lot more wars than many states because they care about their dignity. Examples, the two Balkan wars that are kind of recent, every single battle related with Yugoslavia. This proves that the Serbs are ready to fight when it comes to what is theirs, and when they view Kosovo as theirs, they're not going to give it up. But also, B, the government is again spreading this nationalist propaganda, which again, you can see in the face of Vucic. He's extremely anti-EU. He wants to present the West as the evil actor that is trying to literally ruin Serbian culture in order to get votes. This means that the people do not trust the EU and feel that the government, in the moment of which is trying to please the EU, is first backtracking on their word, secondly prioritizing money before their own nation, which is something that they hate because they were made a promise that they're going to be the most important thing. And notice, I'm going to wait in the beginning before I even rebut later. Before I even rebut, dignity of the Serbian people is the most important thing in this debate because Serbia cares about it the most, and it is more important than economic development and even democracy. Why is that the case? First of all of their impacts are dependent on EU membership. This means that their argumentation as to why the EU is good is dependent on a lot of factors, like are these requirements going to be lowered or not? Is Serbia going to be okay with the amount of lowering that is happening? Is this going to be the tipping point for them? I don't know. They never tell me. Secondly, on direct impacts, the end goal of the good economy and of democracy of the EU is for the Serbian people to feel good. This is what the Serbia as an actor wants. We achieve that directly by not infringing their dignity. And they may try to scam you and say they only have a negative case, but we believe that maintaining your dignity is a pretty good thing that you get on our side of the house, and an important thing that you have to defend. It is not our burden to prove why their dignity will only increase with time. But thirdly, you can access their benefits when it comes to, like for example, democratic bonuses and economic bonuses only when people support you. If the Serbian people don't support you as a precondition to these things, and there are violent protests, if they're constantly blocking the parliament from achieving these sort of good deals, if they're burning things, if they're causing unrest within the country, these things can never happen. So our argument comes as a precondition to this. So we should do it firstly on correct characterization of the Serbian people versus not just asserting, but the Serbs said that they were wrong in the Yugoslav wars, oopsie. And secondly, on scale, simply because the Serbs will be so damaged, their dignity will be so infringed upon to the point to which they literally start violent protests, they start burning buildings, they start hurting each other because this is the most important thing for them, and we analyze the actor correctly. PY.
So the EU let Spain get away with suppressing Catalonia. Why wouldn't let Serbia get away with Kosovo?
Thank you for leading me on to my next point. Notice, they try to prove to you that the EU will remove the regulations simply because they want to compete for Serbia because they're facing a lot of competition. What does this mean? Just because China wants it doesn't mean that it is valuable for me. If I haven't lowered the regulations till now, why would I impose them in the first place? Why would I backtrack on my word? Why would I continue wanting these sort of things? But structural rebuttal when it comes to these mitigated limitations. First of all, it is against the info slide, which means that they're kind of out of the debate, but even if you don't buy that. Two, you aren't sure if Serbia is to be trusted. This means that if they're still fighting in Kosovo, they're bringing bad image to you. And if they don't stop fighting, again the regulation stays. This is extremely contradictory. And when you don't trust Serbia, giving it more money, giving it more intel is only a bad thing for you because they can betray you and hurt you much more. So you have no incentive to do that. This is improper and even. But 3 member countries... No, member countries will never vote for the limitations of these regulations. Why? A, they pursue it, they view it as an unfair thing because in order to join the EU, they had to sacrifice a lot of things. For example, Bulgaria has to agree to the corruption thing and the democratic thing and admit that there is corruption and allow things like commissions to enter the country, which we analyze is not something that the Serbian government will do. Secondly, these countries are losing an opportunity to bargain with Serbia. Why would we just give out the free opportunity to want money from them, to want some specific things? For example, Croatia, that the more important thing for them is to be egotistic and for Serbia to do things regarding their nationality and their national dignity. So what is the bottom line? The bottom line is that member countries will never vote on such limitations, and such limitations are not going to happen. But even if you don't buy that, they never explain how much these limitations are going to, and how much these regulations are going to be lowered. And they never explain why this lowering specifically is going to be enough. In fact, they don't tell you what these requirements are going to be specifically. So when they don't meet this burden, again, this Serbia is still unlikely to join the EU, which again is a precondition to everything good happening when allegedly you join the EU. Okay, on to rebuttal. They're trying to prove an argument that is extremely one-sided and in a vacuum. They're just saying, oh, but EU is good, they trade with each other, versus China is bad. Our argument on economics is much more comparative. The thing that we hear from them is that it's strategically important for China to invest, but also it has no accountability. What we do in this debate is take the exact same mechanisms and expand their logic and flip them. For strategic importance, we explain to you why Serbia is the only country that China can have influence over. So if the EU is taking tariffs on the borders of Bulgaria, it wouldn't care about Serbia, versus China wouldn't take such things on the borders of Bulgaria, which means that it is much more important to have intel in the region because it is the only actor that they can do that. On accountability, we believe that just because China is not a democracy, it can afford to give more to the Serbian people because it doesn't have to please their own people. These are the depth of analysis that goes directly against themselves, and this argument is to a very much extent flipped. And most importantly, they try to prove best of both worlds in their last speech. This cannot happen, we explained in Prop 1. Why? But simply because the EU doesn't want you to have any connection with China. For example, Bulgaria cannot take anything from BRI when they are a member, and China, vice versa, won't allow you to take anything from the EU, and none of these two countries are going to settle unless there is commitment. Please look at your notes, it was in Prop 1. So if you believe that you should protect the reality and how actually the Serbian people look and what they want and they desire, vote proposition today.
The problem with seeing the info slide and making that your entire case is that most of the time it is pretty unresponsive to the other side. So for all the proposition says that Kosovo is important, all of it does is augment our case, because we told you the EU will never impose such harsh regulations. So before I go any further, just note, the majority of harm that third proposition funnels to is out of this debate, but I'll be charitable and engage regardless. When they say then that Serbians hate being controlled, that you lose human dignity, I posit to you, the way you lose human dignity is when you are controlled by an authoritarian state, when other allies do not have veto power, and when China can run rampant. So on their side of the house, it was one where Serbians had no dignity, had no life, and had no identity. You must oppose. I want to ask two questions. First, is going into the EU membership good and possible? And second, whether the alternative of China is one that is likely and one that is good. First, is going into the EU good or not? Their main claim by the end of third proposition is that you'll never vote in Serbia and you will never let them in. Their main claim, therefore, is premised upon Croatia being the only member not wanting Serbia to enter. However, we told you that this wasn't true because other EU members also have say and are more likely to negotiate with Croatia and Serbia to make mutual concessions. This is the tipping point analysis they need to respond to. Most of the EU countries want Serbia into the EU to expand their economic and political gains. 3 reasons.
BOI.
No, thank you. And I want to note this also responds to their claim that you have every other Eastern European country. 1, you want Serbia to increase your economies of scale. This is an analysis that Alina and Houghton tells you, because the more countries you get, the larger your economic benefits can grow because there is no cap. But second, you have greater leverage power as a bloc. The more countries you enter, no thank you, into the EU, the higher you can trade with other countries than the US, like APEC, like ASEAN, etc. Simply because more countries means more resources, means more leveraging power. But third, on politics, this also stabilizes the pan-European identity on our side of the house, because the EU has incentive to let Serbia in, and this takes them at the very best. If the Yugoslav wars are so memorable, the EU has an incentive to let Serbia in and to make mutual concessions for Croatia, Serbia, and Bosnia, and every single Balkan country, because they want to reduce tensions, they want to reduce violence, and they want to reduce border skirmishes. This was a sweet spot and a tipping point analysis they don't respond to. The implication is very straightforward. There is no cap to growth for the EU when they let more countries in. Therefore, on our side of the house, the EU has an incentive to reduce barriers, no thank you, and reduce regulations. Furthermore, they had no response to our analysis that the EU right now fears that Serbia will go turn to China. Notably, this was an exclusive impact because on our side of the house, when Serbia was unclear whether or not they were going to China, that the EU had incentive to court them. At the point when Serbia turned to China, the EU doesn't want to waste resources funding a country that will give it all to China. Therefore, what do they say? They say that Serbia will be forced to make concessions, no thank you, that we never explained how much regulations will be decreased. The problem is that we did, because we told you that the EU has historic examples of doing this, with Hungary, despite it being undemocratic, with Spain, despite suppressing the Catalan and Basque region. All of these examples means that they are not debating against the weight of analysis, but the weight of reality. And this was important, because all of their case hinged upon a theoretical assumption that Kosovo mattered a lot. The more they argue for that, the more they prove that the EU will not force them to recognize Kosovo as an independent state. Before I go on, sure.
You aren't from the EU and you don't know that Bulgaria is the only state which uses its veto power to block North Macedonia's entry. Therefore, Croatia is quite important, and therefore don't claim it isn't. EU has veto power, therefore this isn't the case.
The problem is that Croatia may be able to veto it, but it's not in their incentive to veto it. Because 1, all the economic analysis I gave you thus far. But second, the Yugoslav wars happened, yes, but Serbia has already admitted its guilt via the ICTY. It is unclear, and the proposition therefore needed to prove the tipping point analysis their side so conveniently wanted to say, of why they necessarily wanted to use its veto power against Serbia. They need to prove that the hatred is so deep, is so remnant, that therefore they'll use this tipping point analysis. What then do they say? They say that the EU will fear backlash from Russia because of Ukraine. Therefore, it was only on our side that we could preemptively cut against Russia when Russia is weak right now to accept Serbia into the EU. But let's take them at the highest ground. Let's say the EU doesn't accept Serbia. Why do we still win? I want to note here, I'm being incredibly charitable. Why do we still win? The most important reason why we win is because on their side, Serbia reduces its bilateral trade relations. I want to know a fact about the vote. That Serbia's biggest importer and exporter is Germany, a major power in the EU. At the point in which Serbia announces, I want to ally myself with China, it is at that point, Germany reduces trade with Serbia. Germany reduces its imports and exports of manufacturing, of agriculture. And this hurts the Serbian economy, because Serbia is a population of 6.6 million people. It did not have the manpower, it did not have the resources to sustain on its own. On our highest ground, Serbia doesn't get into the EU. It gets Germany, it gets bilateral trade agreements, it helps the Serbian population to lead a dignified life. We win on their own metric. Second question, or whether China will treat Serbia well. And here's one we'll note strategically, you're pretty unsound, because First Speaker couldn't run a negative case without proving why China will accept Serbia into its alliances. So let's explain quite clearly why China won't do so. One, because China has no incentive to develop their allies. They say that China is an export-oriented industry. It's precisely because China is export-oriented that they want to do things like pump and dump into Serbia. Because what Alina and Houghton tells you, that China right now is facing excess exports, i.e. it wants to put all of its manufacturing, all of its exports within Serbia. And this was bad, because it means many local and domestic Serbian businesses get crowded out on their side, which is why when you walk past Crown Plaza, you see Huawei, you see the Bank of China, which means that many domestic businesses cannot go. On our side of the house, the EU does not have the same incentive because the growth of a local domestic population industry also benefits the EU as per my analysis. This is bad because China right now is also economically unsound in terms of ability because it's facing a housing crisis. Now to note, this is far worse on their side of the house because the housing crisis hurt China economically far worse than any amount of inflation that the EU could experience ever does. Because the housing market underpinned the majority of the Chinese economy, which means that it took very long for them to recover. And the way we know this is because it took very long for the 2008 crisis to be recovered on the part of the US. So even if China had the incentive, it had no ability. Why did all of this matter? This mattered because they don't respond to the weighing of accountability that we tell you. That China is undemocratic, they did not have a veto power, and that China could do whatever they want. So listen to their very own mechanisms. That China has an incentive to treat Serbia well because it wants intel from the European Union. If this was true, then Serbia on their side was simply an information dog for China. If they want to talk about the lack of dignity, it was on their side of the house. Therefore, the implication is very straightforward. On their side, China has no allies to keep it in check because the majority of African states, therefore, have not enough leverage power. Conversely, China is able to do things like withdraw aid during times where Serbia cannot expect it because it's completely dependent on its own domestic population. No, thank you. Therefore, even if it's true that at some points that China may be good to Serbia, at other points it will be bad. On our side, this isn't true because Serbia, for instance, can be built up by things like the EDB on our side of the house, and the EU has an incentive to do this because it has democratic checks and balances. At the end of this speech, then, I want to note what proposition strategically misses out in the entirety of their case. One, their arguments rely on the naive assumption that the info slide is always true and it's always argumentatively strong. We told you that these barriers exist, but these barriers are decreasing over time precisely because the EU has an incentive to reduce these barriers in the long term. But second, even if it's true that the EU won't accept these Serbia in, they have not proven their positive material why China will be good. Because they have no response to our first and second argument of why China is exploitative, why China is bad, and why China is unaccountable. Their reply, although very late, needs to prove why China is able to treat Serbia well and has the ability to treat Serbia well, given there is very little resources, given there's export-oriented, given there's a historic track record of pump and dump. They need to respond to reality. They have not done so far. I am very proud to oppose.
To emerge at the end of this debate, proposition's vote that was woefully ignorant and painfully unresponsive, and our vote that was economically sustainable and genuinely dignifying. First, on their vote, and their strategy throughout this debate is to impact arguments they have not actually proven. They talk a big deal about Serbian dignity, about Serbians not paying taxes and doing crime as a result of joining the EU. But the more they argue that Serbia is unrelenting on issues like democracy, corruption, and Kosovo, the more likely it is on our side that the EU is going to give in first. But so they ask, how much will the EU relax regulations? Unfortunately, we explained this to you as early as first speaker. When we explained the EU lets Hungary get away with not imposing sanctions on Russia or being blatantly undemocratic, let Spain get away with suppressing Catalonia. Those are the kinds of concessions the EU is going to give on our side. So when they asserted that EU members won't vote to lower regulations, that assertion from third speaker was insufficient to counter 3 minutes of analysis from our first speaker that one, they have an incentive to now change because they need to block against Russian influence. And second, that they now need to prevent Serbia from going towards China. The difference is on their side and their road. They drive Serbia to the point of no return when they completely cut off the EU, go towards China, and succumb to the whims of yet another foreign power with no voting power at all or no veto power. So they choose, therefore, to just not respond to any of the things that they say. So they say there's an unproven claim on Croatia hanging around in this debate. But if that were true, on our side we flip that. Because when you join the EU, you can extract concessions from Croatia. And so does it work the other way around. Because there's now mutual aid that pieces and heals over the scars of 20 years ago. So no, they won't veto Serbia's entrance. They retreat, therefore, to only one benefit, that now Serbians can smoke indoors. Unfortunately, it is deeply unclear to me why that stands in this debate. Because I would argue to you that Serbians in many cases might genuinely care about things like democracy far more than whatever they assert. As you can see from the 2022 protests, so one reductive characterization of Serbia cannot win them this debate. Unfortunately, therefore, their positive case only emerges in their third argument that they don't revive, that China wants allies in Europe. That might be true, but it is deeply unclear that this means they will treat Serbia well, because China wants allies so they can dump their export surpluses onto them. That is why, across the hotel, you can see Chinese companies dominating instead of Serbian companies. The EU, comparatively, sells as one collective market. So they have every incentive to make Serbia better because individual strength is collective strength. They retreat, therefore, to an assertion that China has money. Unfortunately, so does the EU. So the weight, therefore, lands on incentive and not an unproven assertion. So unfortunately, the only analysis they give us in their vote is that whatever the EU has done before, it will keep doing. Unfortunately, the past is not the present. Our vote, therefore, recognized that change is indeed possible. And we argue to you with structural analysis that is too late to respond to in reply, that the EU is going to let Serbia in. But more importantly, that the EU has better incentives when compared to China. Because as I explained to you, they genuinely want Serbia to be strong. And they are far more diversified. Because within the EU, there are multiple different markets that are far more complementary to Serbia's interests. Whereas Serbia and China sell largely the same things, so China wants to keep them poor. China comparatively, therefore, has poor incentives. So at the end of this debate, if it is the case that you don't buy any analysis on ability nor incentive, I want you to weigh on accountability. Because it is only on our side that the EU is democratic, has to account for what it does and has to give justifications. On their side, as they say, China doesn't need to appeal to anyone. That is harmful, because when a bad thing happens, nobody can call them out. So before Prop Reply goes on to impact nationalism in reply, I want you to ask yourself whether they have proven any of their claims. They have not. Oppose.
I will start the speech on my next quote. Panel, I really enjoyed Team Singapore refuting our examples rather than our structural reasons the past 3 speeches, but when we look at reality, we can see that we have underlying logic that goes under these examples that was never refuted. This is why we should win this debate. Panel, we also give examples of nations that will not allow Serbia. They give examples of why these reasons the nations will allow Serbia. We give illustration of people being against the EU. They give illustration of people being pro-EU. We argue about examples a lot, right? But panel, having in mind we both have examples. We say Macedonia, they say they will make a compromise. We say Macedonia never made a compromise. They say Croatia will make a compromise. We should look at the end of the day at the structural reasons, not at the examples given in the debate. What do we mean by this? Let's look firstly on the first clash on will they enter the EU. Notice how firstly they say mutual help with another country and all these things. Then this is the structural reason. I will ignore the Croatian examples of all these things. Notice, countries have incentive to demand things, but also they will never do things by the info slide. This is what we say. But notice, panel, in second, I explained why the biggest incentive for these countries and the politicians that are in the European Parliament is for people to re-elect them and to vote for them. This is what I explained in second. This is the biggest incentive. Note, so no matter how much economy they prove of scale, which came in third speech a bit too late if you ask me, or like of reduced border skirmishes or whatever, this doesn't matter because the biggest incentive is being re-elected. And this is only proven on our side of the house. So this is what this class should be adjudicated on. And then they give the Hungary example. Guys, they're literally paying 3 million a day due to them not going with European values. This is literally happening. They're being punished right now. If we still want to play the example game, which I don't, then let's continue to the second question on who will give more money. They say China will debt trap you. They only prove ability. They never prove incentive. They give a bunch of Asian countries that are debt trapped, I don't care. Right. This is never proven. Ability is maybe, I will give them that, but incentive is not. In third and second, we explain why they have incentive for the people to be richer so that they can export more to the people so them themselves can get richer. Never refuted, ever in the debate. They refute only the example. If this reason stays, then I don't care for accountability, which they were as most important. Why? Because I don't need to keep somebody who has good incentives accountable. If somebody wants to make me rich, I don't care if he's accountable or not, right? But then, they say BRICS, guys, you never prove it. We prove it in first, and they repeat in second. We say that China wants to secure you, and the only way to secure you is to tie you up in BRICS. We say this in first and second. They simply call out that this was never refuted. And if they enter BRICS, this is better. Why? Because that's a union, and this is one more incentive for China, and all the benefits of a union come to us. Right. They say in third, Germany will stop trading. Guys, Germany is not a little kid. It had incentive and ability to trade with Serbia before. It will have incentive and ability to trade with Serbia after it goes to China. The incentive and ability of Germany don't change, or you need to prove how they change, right? What are the pathways to victory? Firstly, uncertainty. Their positive case kicks in only if Serbia is accepted in the EU. We explained why it is better if it's not accepted and if it's accepted, and we believe the more likely case it's not accepted since they never refuted our reasons or never recovered from our refutations to their reasons. Right, but our case happens 100% of the time, and 100% of the time we win. But secondly, in third, we weigh why dignity is the most important. On debt, dignity is more important than having a bit more money. This is what makes you, this is for a region that was poor, this is all they have left. We should not take their dignity, and we are the only side that keeps it.